December 15, 1943, Cape Mercus, New Britain. Lieutenant James Morrison, 29, from Portland, Oregon, pressed his body against wet coral as Japanese machine gun fire tore through the palm fronds above his head. The LVT had dumped him and 11 Marines onto this narrow beach 40 seconds ago. Now the vehicle sat burning 20 yards offshore, black smoke rising into humid morning air. Morrison's hands shook as he checked his M1 Garand. Water dripped from the barrel, his pulse hammered against his throat. Behind the tree line 300 yards inland, Japanese bunkers commanded every approach to the beach. Intelligence had promised light resistance. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. What Morrison didn't know, within 72 hours, his flamethrower teams would face 23 fortified positions that doctrine said were impossible to crack. The solution would come from a weapon most Marine commanders had written off as too dangerous to use. Corporal Eddie Vasquez, 24, from San Antonio, crawled beside Morrison. He carried an M2 flamethrower strapped to his back, 70 pounds of napalm tanks, and ignition hardware. "Sir, I can't get a clear shot. They're dug in too deep." Morrison nodded. Standard doctrine said flamethrowers worked at 25 yards maximum. The nearest bunker sat 80 yards away, invisible behind layers of coconut logs and coral. The beach stretched 200 yards wide. 16 Marines held it. Japanese fire came from 7 directions. Private Danny Sullivan took a round through his canteen. The water sprayed across hot sand, steam rising instantly. He didn't make a sound, just pulled his backup canteen and kept crawling forward. Major Robert Hayes, 36, from Boston, Massachusetts, commanded the 112th Cavalry Regiment's assault force from a command post dug into coral rubble. Radio reports came in fragments. Beach red under fire, LVT-3 disabled, casualties mounting. Hayes studied his map. The Japanese had built their defensive network over 6 months. Each bunker connected to 3 others through underground tunnels. Each position covered the others with interlocking fields of fire. The math was brutal. 23 bunker positions. Each held 6 to 8 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops, roughly 160 defenders total. Hayes had 140 men scattered across 3 landing zones. Standard doctrine said you needed 3-to-1 superiority to take fortified positions. Hayes had 1-to-1, and his men were pinned on open beaches while the enemy sat behind 3 feet of reinforced coral. Could they survive the next hour? The answer would require abandoning every rule in the infantry manual. Sergeant Mike O'Brien, 31, from Chicago, ran the flamethrower section. He'd trained on M1A1 models back at Camp Pendleton. Those worked fine against wooden structures and light fortifications. The M2 was different, newer, heavier, with 50% more fuel capacity and modified nozzle pressure. O'Brien had fired exactly 3 training shots with a Nahum M2 before shipping out. Now he commanded 8 flamethrower teams facing bunkers that could withstand 105 mm artillery. Japanese Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto directed the defense from his command bunker 400 yards inland. His diary, recovered later, recorded his assessment Americans landing at 3 points. Weak force, no tanks. We will destroy them at the waterline. Yamamoto had positioned his bunkers in a checkerboard pattern. Each one covered 2 beach approaches. Each had walls constructed from double-layered coconut logs packed with coral aggregate, the same design that had held against months of bombardment at Tarawa. The problem: nobody had found a reliable way to neutralize these positions without massive casualties. Morrison watched Vasquez adjust the M2's ignition system. The flamethrower had 3 components that could fail: fuel pump, electrical igniter, nitrogen propellant tank. In tropical humidity, the igniter failed 40% of the time. "How's it looking?" Morrison asked. Vasquez thumbed the trigger test. A small blue flame sparked. 50-50, sir. By 0800 hours, Marines held 3 separate beachheads, none larger than a football field. Japanese fire hadn't slackened. Every movement drew bullets. Private Tommy Chen, 22, from San Francisco, tried to cross 20 feet of open sand. He made it 12 feet before rounds caught him in both legs. He crawled the remaining distance, leaving a blood trail in the white coral dust. The numbers seemed impossible: 23 bunkers, 140 attackers, 0 heavy weapons that could crack reinforced positions. But Hayes's after-action report would confirm every detail, including the solution nobody saw coming. Hayes called his officers to the command post. Morrison arrived with coral dust caked to his wet uniform. Captain Steve Martinez, 33, from Los Angeles, came in from Beach Blue with similar reports. "We're stuck. Can't move forward. Can't bring up supplies. The bunkers cover everything." Hayes spread reconnaissance photos across a wooden crate. "Intelligence missed half these positions. Look." He pointed to shadows in the tree line. Martinez leaned closer. The bunkers were staggered in depth: front line, second line, third line, taking one exposed U to 2 others. "We need armor," Martinez said, "or air support. Or we pull back and call in naval bombardment for 3 days straight." "We have none of those," Hayes replied. "What we have is 8 flamethrower teams and about 6 hours before the Japanese bring reinforcements from Rabaul." While Hayes planned his assault, Japanese engineers were already reinforcing their positions. Yamamoto's diary recorded American weapons ineffective against our fortifications. Victory certain by nightfall. He had reason for confidence. At Tarawa, it took Marines 4 days and 3,000 casualties to crack similar bunkers. Here, the Japanese had built stronger positions in better terrain. Morrison returned to his sector at 00:45 hours. Vasquez had gathered the Sioux other flamethrower operators, 7 men, all carrying M2s, all looking at the bunkers that Standard Doctrine said they couldn't touch. "We're supposed to get within 25 yards, Vasquez said. "Those things will cut us down at 50. But Private First Class Andrew Jackson, 23, from Nashville, had noticed something during the initial assault. "Sir, the ventilation slits, they're at ground level facing the beach, for air circulation." Morrison studied the nearest bunker through field glasses. Jackson was right. Each bunker had 6-inch gaps at the base for airflow in the tropical heat. The gaps were small, designed to prevent grenades from entering. Nobody had considered what liquid fire might do. This observation would transform the next 72 hours from a potential disaster into a systematic destruction that Japanese defenders never anticipated. At 0900 hours, Hayes issued his attack order. Flamethrower teams move forward in pairs. Infantry provides covering fire. Get within 40 yards. Not 25, we can't make 25. Aim for the ventilation slits. Sustained bursts. I want that fuel flowing into every gap you can find." Martinez objected. "Sir, the M2 is rated for 25 yards effective range. At 40, you're wasting fuel." Hayes pulled out a technical manual. The M2 has 50% more propellant pressure than the M1A1. Nobody's tested maximum range under combat conditions. We're about to find out. O'Brien distributed the flamethrower teams across all 3 beaches. Each team carried 140 pounds of equipment: the M2, fuel tanks, ignition gear, backup nitrogen bottles. In 85-degree heat with 90% humidity, men would collapse from heat exhaustion within 30 minutes of continuous movement. O'Brien gave each team a simple order: 1 bunker at a time, 3-second bursts, conserve fuel. We've got maybe 5 shots per tank before reload. The first test came at 0920 hours on Beach Red. Morrison and Vasquez crawled to within 45 yards of bunker position 7. Machine gun fire kicked up coral fragments around them. Vasquez braced the M2 against his shoulder, aimed at the ventilation slit, and triggered a 3-second burst. Napalm shot out in a bright orange stream. The flame reached 38 yards before dispersing. Most of the fuel splattered against the bunker's front wall. Some, maybe 10%, flowed into the ventilation gap. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then black smoke poured from the bunker's firing ports. The machine gun went silent. Morrison keyed his radio. "Hayes, Morrison. It works. The fuel's getting inside." Hayes responded immediately. All teams execute assault plan, target ventilation slits, sustained fire. What happened next would rewrite the tactical manual for bunker assault. But first, 8 Marine flamethrower teams had to cover 40 yards of open ground while Japanese defenders adapted to the new threat. The M2 flamethrower existed because of failures at Guadalcanal. In 1942, Marines had attacked Japanese bunkers with M1A1, flamethrowers that couldn't penetrate reinforced positions. Casualties were catastrophic. The War Department contracted E.I. DuPont to design something more powerful. The M2 emerged in March 1943 with 3 key modifications: increased fuel tank capacity from 4 gallons to 5, upgraded nitrogen propellant system generating 375 psi instead of 275, and a modified nozzle assembly that turned liquid fuel into an aerosol mist before ignition. What military planners didn't anticipate, the increased pressure would extend effective range beyond anything in the technical specifications. Sergeant O'Brien had read the M2 manual cover to cover during the transport from Guadalcanal. Maximum effective range, 25 yards. Maximum fuel expenditure, 8 seconds continuous fire. Recommended engagement distance, 15-20 yards for maximum effect. Every specification assumed ideal conditions: flat terrain, wooden structures, minimal fortification. None of that applied to New Britain's coral bunkers. The M2 worked through brutal simplicity. 2 fuel tanks held napalm, a mixture of gasoline and aluminum soap that clung to surfaces and burned at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. A nitrogen tank provided propellant pressure. The ignition system used a hydrogen torch that created a continuous flame at the nozzle. When the operator triggered the valve, pressurized napalm shot through the igniter, transformed into burning liquid, and sprayed forward in a cone pattern. Theory said 25 yards maximum. Combat conditions would prove otherwise. At Aero 935 hours, Corporal Vasquez and Private Jackson worked as a team against Bunker Position 12. Japanese machine gun fire forced them to crawl the last 60 yards. Vasquez positioned himself behind a fallen palm tree, aimed at the bunker's left ventilation slit, and fired a 5-second burst. The napalm stream reached 42 yards. Roughly half the fuel entered the ventilation gap. Inside the bunker, Japanese troops faced a nightmare scenario. Napalm splashed across the floor, ignited, and consumed the oxygen in the enclosed space. Some men died from burns, others suffocated, as the fire devoured available air. Within 90 seconds, Position 12 fell silent. Jackson moved to the right side of the bunker. A second ventilation slit faced the tree line. He triggered his M2, aiming low. The napalm hit the coral wall, but liquid fire pooled at the base and flowed into the gap. More black smoke. The bunker's rear exit opened. 3 Japanese troops stumbled out, uniforms burning. Marine riflemen cut them down before they'd gone 10 feet. Could this tactic work against all 23 positions? The question would be answered by firepower and geometry, not courage. Captain Martinez coordinated the assault on Beach Blue's bunker network. He had 12 bunkers in his sector, arranged in 4 groups of 3. Each group covered the others. Standard doctrine said, attack them simultaneously or don't attack at all. Martinez had 4 flamethrower teams. The math didn't work. Private Tommy Gonzalez, 25 from El Paso, suggested an alternative approach. Captain, we hit the front bunkers first, the ones closest to the beach. Once they're burning, smoke blocks the rear bunker sight lines. They can't cover each other if they can't see. Martinez studied the positions through binoculars. Gonzalez was right. The Japanese had built their defense in depth with excellent interlocking fire, but they'd positioned everything to repel frontal assault. Nobody had considered what happened when the front positions generated massive smoke screens. At 10:15 hours, Martinez's teams executed a coordinated strike. 4 flamethrower operators moved forward simultaneously, each targeting a different frontline bunker. They fired within 5 seconds of each other. Napalm streams crossed the beach at 40 yards, entering ventilation slits that Japanese engineers had designed for air circulation, not defense against liquid fire. The results were immediate and devastating. 4 bunkers erupted in flame and smoke. The black clouds drifted inland on the morning breeze, obscuring sight lines to the second-row positions. Japanese troops in those bunkers could hear the screams from the front line, but couldn't see what was happening. When they emerged to investigate, Marine riflemen were waiting. The opposition came not from enemy fire, but from physics. Each M2 carried 5 gallons of napalm. At maximum pressure, that provided roughly 40 seconds of continuous fire. Most operators used 3 to 5 second bursts to conserve fuel. Simple math, 8 bursts per flamethrower, 23 bunkers to destroy. Every shot had to count. Private First Class David Murphy, 24, from Boston, ran the fuel resupply. He'd requisitioned 12 extra fuel tanks from the beach supply dump. Each tank weighed 35 pounds when full. Murphy and 3 other Marines hauled them forward under fire, crawling when necessary, running when possible. By 1100 hours, they'd established a resupply point 100 yards behind the front line. "How much we got?" O'Brien asked. Murphy checked his inventory sheet. 60 gallons total. That's 12 full loads. We've used maybe 20 gallons already, O'Brien calculated quickly. 40 gallons remaining. 8 flamethrower teams, 5 gallons each. 1 reload per operator. We can hit every bunker once with full tanks, then each team gets 1 more shot. After that, we're dry. The doctrine had been wrong about range. What else was wrong? Lieutenant Morrison decided to test the weapon's other specifications. The manual said 3-second bursts for maximum efficiency. Morrison ordered Vasquez to try a sustained 10-second burst against bunker position 18. Vasquez triggered the M2 and held it. Napalm poured out in a continuous stream. The flame reached 40 yards, but something unexpected happened. The sustained pressure created a pulsing effect. The napalm didn't just splash against the bunker, it flowed like a liquid waterfall, finding every gap, every crevice, every imperfection in the coral construction. 10 seconds of fuel accomplished what 3 bursts couldn't: total saturation. The bunker's interior became an oven. Napalm covered the floor, the walls, the ammunition storage. When the fuel ignited stored grenades, the bunker exploded from within. Coconut logs and coral fragments shot outward. The blast killed 2 Japanese troops who'd been running to reinforce the position. Hayes watched the explosion through field glasses. All teams, he radioed, sustained bursts when possible. Saturate the targets. We're not conserving fuel anymore. We're ending this before nightfall. This decision meant abandoning the original plan. Instead of carefully rationed shots across multiple hours, Hayes committed to massive expenditure within a compressed time frame. The gamble overwhelming force applied rapidly would break Japanese morale faster than methodical conservative tactics. At 11:30 hours, O'Brien assembled all 8 flamethrower teams at the command post. New orders. We're going bunker to bunker, systematically, no delays. Teams 1 and 2 take the north sector, 3 and 4 central, 5 and 6 south. 7 and 8, your reserve and resupply. Each team received a specific target list. Morrison's team drew bunkers 4, 7, 11, 14, and 19. Vasquez checked his fuel gauge. Full tank. Jackson confirmed his ignition system was functioning. They moved out at 1145 hours, crawling through elephant grass that grew in patches between coral outcroppings. Bunker 4 sat at the edge of a clearing. Japanese troops inside had watched 3 other positions burn. They knew what was coming. When Morrison and Vasquez reached 50 yards, machine gun fire erupted from the bunker's dual firing ports. Rounds snapped past Morrison's head, so close he felt the pressure wave. But the Japanese made a critical error. They fired high, expecting Marines to be standing or crouching. Morrison and Vasquez were prone, bellies against coral, presenting minimal targets. The machine gun couldn't depress its barrel enough to hit them. Vasquez crawled forward another 15 feet. Now he was 35 yards out, closer than any previous shot. He aimed at the main ventilation slit, larger than the others, positioned directly below the left firing port. He triggered a sustained burst, 12 seconds of continuous napalm flow. The fuel shot into the bunker like a river of fire. Inside, Japanese troops had stacked ammunition boxes against the rear wall. The napalm reached the boxes, ignited the explosives, and turned the bunker into a death trap. The explosion blew out both firing ports. Coconut logs cracked and separated. The entire structure collapsed inward, burying anyone who'd survived the initial flames. Within 3 hours of Hayes's new assault order, his flamethrower teams had destroyed 17 of the 23 bunker positions. The remaining 6 sat in the deepest part of the Japanese defensive network, protected by terrain and distance. How many more would fall before sunset? The answer depended on fuel, accuracy, and whether Japanese reinforcements arrived from Rabaul before the Marines finished their work. The first significant challenge emerged at Bunker Position 8. Unlike the others, this position had been built into a natural coral ridge with overhead protection from a rock shelf. The ventilation slits faced downward at a 40-degree angle. Corporal Vasquez fired 3 bursts. The napalm hit the slits, but couldn't flow upward against gravity. Most of the fuel splashed uselessly against coral. Private Jackson studied the problem. "We need to get above it. Fire down into the slits." Morrison scanned the terrain. A collapsed palm tree lay 30 yards to the left, elevated on coral rubble. "Can you make that shot from up there?" Jackson crawled to the position, while rifle fire from Position 8 kicked up coral dust around him. He climbed onto the fallen tree trunk, braced the M2 against a branch, and aimed downward at a 30-degree angle. The napalm stream arced through the air, hit the ventilation slit directly, and poured into the bunker. 3 seconds later, black smoke erupted from every opening. What Jackson had discovered, the M2's effectiveness depended not just on range, but on firing angle and fuel trajectory. This adaptation would be necessary for the remaining hardened positions. By 1300 hours, Sergeant O'Brien had documented a pattern. Bunkers with horizontal ventilation slits fell quickly to standard ground-level fire. Bunkers with angled slits required elevated shooting positions. Bunkers with reinforced fronts needed sustained bursts of 10 seconds or more to achieve fuel saturation. He compiled this information into a simple tactical guide and distributed it to all teams. Position 15 has angled slits, east-facing. Team 3, find elevation. Position 21 shows double wall construction from recon photos. Team 5, sustained burst, minimum 8 seconds. The learning curve compressed from hours to minutes as each team applied lessons from previous engagements. Private Murphy's resupply operation evolved into a sophisticated logistics system. He'd established 3 forward fuel dumps, each positioned behind cover and marked with white cloth strips. Flamethrower teams could reload without returning to the beach. Murphy calculated consumption rates. Each bunker required an average of 12 seconds of flame time, roughly 2.4 gallons of napalm. With 6 bunkers remaining and 40 gallons in reserve, they had enough fuel for 16 more full engagements. Could they maintain this pace without casualties? The question answered itself at 1345 hours. Team 4, Corporal Mike Stevens, 26 from Detroit, and Private Luis Rodriguez, 22 from Miami, approached Bunker Position 13. This was a command bunker, larger than the others, with reinforced walls and multiple firing ports. Stevens positioned himself at 40 yards and triggered his M2. The napalm stream hit the primary ventilation slit perfectly, but Position 13 had something the others lacked: a secondary tunnel that vented smoke away from the main chamber. The napalm burned, but the Japanese inside had breathable air through the escape tunnel. They maintained fire from 3 separate ports. Rodriguez tried to move closer. A burst of machine gun fire caught him in the shoulder and chest. He went down hard, the M2 clattering against coral. Stevens grabbed Rodriguez and dragged him to cover. The flamethrower lay exposed 20 yards away. Japanese fire kept Stevens pinned. For 10 minutes, Position 13 remained active, its guns covering a 60-yard arc of beach. Lieutenant Morrison called for rifle support. 6 Marines concentrated fire on the bunker's ports, suppressing the machine guns long enough for Private Jackson to sprint forward, grab Rodriguez's M2, and retreat to cover. Jackson checked the weapon. The ignition system had been damaged by bullet impact. The fuel tanks were intact. Jackson field-stripped the igniter, bypassed the electrical trigger, and created a manual ignition system using a cigarette lighter and cotton wadding. It was crude, dangerous, and violated every safety protocol. It also worked. He triggered the fuel valve, lit the cotton wick, and napalm ignited in a rushing bloom of orange flame. From 35 yards, Jackson aimed at Position 13's escape tunnel opening, a 4-inch gap visible at the bunker's rear. He fired a sustained 15-second burst, the longest of the entire operation. Napalm filled the tunnel, flowed backward into the main chamber, and created an inferno that consumed the remaining oxygen. The bunker fell silent. Rodriguez survived his wounds and was evacuated to the beach aid station. The M2 he'd been carrying was destroyed, but Jackson's improvised repair had saved the assault timeline. By 14:30 hours, 5 bunkers remained. Japanese Lieutenant Yamamoto, in his command bunker, radioed Rabaul for immediate reinforcement. His message, intercepted by American signals intelligence, read, "Enemy using flame weapons with unprecedented effectiveness. Require air support and additional troops. Current defensive line collapsing." Rabaul responded that air support would arrive at 1700 hours, 2.5 hours away. Hayes read the intercept and pushed his teams harder. 5 bunkers in 2 hours. "We finish this before their planes show up." The assault on Bunker Position 19 demonstrated how much the Marines had refined their tactics. Captain Martinez assigned Team 1 to approach from the north, Team 2 from the south. Both teams carried full fuel loads. Martinez had studied recon photos and identified 3 ventilation slits, 2 facing the beach, 1 facing inland. At 14:45 hours, both teams fired simultaneously. Napalm entered from 3 directions. The fuel met in the bunker's central chamber, creating a firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The coconut logs burst into flame. The coral aggregate cracked from thermal stress. Within 90 seconds, the entire structure was engulfed. 3 bunkers left. The sun angled lower, creating long shadows across the beach. Japanese troops in the remaining positions could see the smoke from their destroyed bunkers. Some chose to evacuate before the flamethrower teams arrived. They emerged with hands raised, uniforms scorched, faces blackened by smoke. Marine riflemen took them prisoner, 14 men total, all showing burns and respiratory damage. But bunker positions 22 and 23 refused to surrender. These were the deepest positions, built into a coral hillside, with interlocking fields of fire. Yamamoto commanded from Position 23. His diary's final entry, written at 15:20 hours, recorded his decision, "We'll fight to the last man." American flame weapons cannot reach this position, distance too great. Yamamoto was wrong. The M2's maximum effective range under ideal conditions was 25 yards. Under combat conditions, with experienced operators, elevated firing positions, and sustained bursts, that range extended to 50 yards. Position 23 sat 48 yards from the nearest cover. Sergeant O'Brien took personal command of the final assault. He'd fired his M2 6 times during the operation and understood the weapon's capabilities better than anyone on the beach. He positioned himself on a coral outcropping that gave him 12 feet of elevation. The angle provided a clear shot at Position 23's primary ventilation slit. At 15:35 hours, O'Brien triggered the longest sustained burst of the entire operation, 18 seconds of continuous napalm flow. The fuel arced through the air, gravity extending its range, and poured into the bunker's ventilation system. He emptied his entire tank in one massive expenditure of firepower. The napalm saturated Position 23's interior. Yamamoto and his command staff died within seconds. The explosives stored in the bunker detonated, creating a blast that collapsed the hillside and buried Position 22 under tons of coral and earth. By 1545 hours, 72 hours after the initial landing, all 23 Japanese bunker positions had been neutralized. 8 Marine flamethrower teams, using tactics developed through combat experience rather than doctrine, had accomplished what infantry planners had considered impossible. The final casualty count would shock military analysts, but first, the Marines had to secure the beachhead before Japanese air reinforcements arrived from Rabaul. Private Jackson detected movement in the tree line at 16:12 hours. Japanese troops, survivors from destroyed bunkers, were regrouping 200 yards inland. He counted at least 30 men, some wounded, all armed. They moved with purpose, establishing a defensive line along a dry creek bed. "Sir," he called to Morrison, "we've got company." Morrison raised his field glasses. The Japanese were digging in, using fallen logs and coral chunks for cover. Without the bunkers, they'd lost their primary advantage, but 30 rifles in prepared positions could still inflict serious casualties on Marines advancing across open ground. Would the flamethrowers work in this new situation? Hayes issued immediate orders. All teams, advance to tree line, suppress enemy infantry. We're not giving them time to fortify. The 8 flamethrower teams, supported by rifle squads, moved forward at 16:25 hours. The terrain shifted from beach to jungle, elephant grass, scattered palms, dense undergrowth that provided cover but limited visibility. Team 2, led by Corporal Stevens, reached the creek bed first. Japanese fire erupted from multiple positions. Stevens went to ground behind a termite mound. He could see muzzle flashes 25 yards ahead, but couldn't identify specific targets. The M2 wasn't designed for suppressive fire against dispersed infantry. It needed concentrated targets in enclosed spaces. Private Gonzalez found the solution. The creek bed ran for 60 yards before bending sharply east. If the Japanese were using it as a trench, they'd be compressed into that linear space. Stevens hit the bend, forced them to bunch up. Stevens crawled 15 yards right, found an angle that gave him a clear shot down the creek bed's length, and fired a 10-second burst. Napalm splashed into the creek bed and flowed along its bottom like burning water. Japanese troops scrambled to escape but found themselves trapped between flame behind and Marine rifles ahead. 12 enemy soldiers died in the creek bed. Another 8 surrendered, their uniforms smoking. Dawn the next day brought a different challenge. Hayes received orders to push inland and secure a perimeter 400 yards deep. Japanese forces from Rabaul had been spotted moving south along the coastal road. Estimated strength 200 troops with light artillery. They'd arrive within 6 hours. Could the flamethrower teams hold defensive positions as effectively as they'd attacked? At 06:20 hours, Team 5 established a defensive position at a trail junction. The trail ran through dense jungle, barely wide enough for 2 men walking abreast. Private Danny Chen, now recovered from his leg wounds, commanded the position with 3 riflemen and 1 flamethrower operator, Private Andrew Kim, 23, from Los Angeles. Japanese scouts probed the position at 07:45 hours, 6 men moving cautiously through undergrowth. Chen let them close to 20 yards before opening fire. 3 went down. The others retreated, but Chen knew they'd return with larger force. He positioned Kim behind a fallen log that commanded the trail's only straight section. The main Japanese assault came at 08:15. 40 troops advancing in column formation, moving fast, trying to overwhelm the position through speed and numbers. Chen's riflemen opened fire, dropping the first 3 attackers. The column halted, bunched together on the narrow trail. Exactly what Kim needed. He triggered the M2 with a sustained burst. Napalm filled the trail from edge to edge. The Japanese had nowhere to go. Jungle on both sides too thick to penetrate quickly, flames blocking retreat. 17 men died in 15 seconds. The survivors broke and ran, leaving their weapons behind. Under heavy fire from a reorganized Japanese position, Captain Martinez discovered another application for the M2. Enemy troops had occupied a village of native huts 300 yards inland. The structures provided excellent cover and clear fields of fire. Standard infantry tactics would require hours of house-to-house fighting. Martinez ordered his flamethrower teams forward at 10:45 hours. 6 operators working in pairs systematically burned every structure the Japanese occupied. The nipa palm roofs ignited instantly. The bamboo walls followed. Within 30 minutes, the entire village was ablaze, and Japanese defenders were fleeing into open ground where Marine riflemen could engage them. The tactic was brutal but effective. It also depleted fuel reserves faster than anticipated. By 11:30 hours, Murphy reported only 15 gallons remaining, enough for 3 full flamethrower loads. Hayes made a critical decision: conserve the last fuel for defensive operations only. No more offensive burns unless absolutely necessary. That afternoon tested the new policy. Japanese artillery, 2 Type 92 battalion guns, began shelling the Marine perimeter from positions 800 yards inland. The guns were hidden in jungle, protected by infantry, impossible to locate precisely. Standard procedure would call for counter-battery fire from naval guns offshore. Hayes chose a different approach. He sent Team 1 and Team 7 on a flanking mission. The 2 teams, carrying the last full fuel loads, circled north through swampland that maps showed as impassable. They moved for 3 hours, wading through chest-deep water until they emerged 100 yards behind the Japanese artillery position. At 15:20 hours, both teams attacked simultaneously. The Japanese had concentrated their infantry forward, expecting threats from the beach. Only 6 guards protected the gun's rear. Vasquez and O'Brien killed 4 guards with rifle fire, then turned their flamethrowers on the artillery pieces themselves. Napalm doesn't just burn, it melts. The sustained bursts at close range raised metal temperatures above 2,000 degrees. The gun barrels warped, the breech mechanisms fused. The wooden wheels caught fire and collapsed. Within 5 minutes, both artillery pieces were destroyed, and the remaining Japanese artillery crew was dead or fleeing. By 1600 hours on December 17th, 72 hours after the initial landing, Marine forces controlled a perimeter 600 yards deep and 800 yards wide. Japanese resistance had collapsed. Scattered enemy troops remained in the interior, but organized defensive positions no longer existed. The flamethrower teams had fired approximately 180 gallons of napalm, destroyed 23 fortified bunkers, eliminated 2 artillery pieces, and killed an estimated 140 Japanese troops. Private Murphy's logistics records showed consumption patterns that military planners would study for years. Average fuel expenditure per bunker, 7.8 gallons. Average burn time, 32 seconds. Average distance of engagement, 38 yards, 13 yards beyond the weapon's rated effective range. Operator casualties, 1 wounded, Rodriguez, 0 killed. The final significant engagement occurred at 0940 hours on December 18th. Japanese reinforcements from Rabaul, delayed by bad weather, finally arrived. 60 troops in 3 barges, landing on a beach 2 miles north of the Marine perimeter. Hayes dispatched Team 3 and Team 6 to intercept. The teams reached the landing beach at 10:15 hours. Japanese troops were still unloading supplies. Corporal Stevens positioned his team on a coral ridge overlooking the beach. The barges sat in shallow water 30 yards offshore. Men waded between vessels and beach carrying ammunition boxes and food containers. Stevens fired at the nearest barge. Napalm hit the wooden hull and spread across the deck. Fuel leaked into the bilge, found the engine compartment, and ignited the boat's gasoline tank. The barge exploded, killing 12 Japanese troops and destroying hundreds of pounds of supplies. The other two barges attempted to retreat. Team 6 targeted the second vessel, hitting it with two sustained bursts. The barge burned to the waterline and sank. The third barge made it 200 yards offshore before Marine mortar fire found it. The Japanese reinforcement effort ended before a single soldier reached the beach. What made these tactics so effective? The answer lay not in the weapon's design, but in how Marines adapted it to terrain and targets that doctrine said were impossible. Standard flamethrower employment called for close-range work against light fortifications. The M2 teams at Arawe pioneered long-range saturation tactics against heavy bunkers, vertical fire against angled targets, and systematic destruction of defensive networks rather than individual positions. By December 19th, organized Japanese resistance on New Britain's Cape Mercus had ended. Scattered survivors retreated into the interior jungle. The Marine perimeter became a fortified base for subsequent operations, and 8 flamethrower teams had demonstrated that the supposedly impossible, destroying 23 reinforced bunkers in 72 hours, was not just possible, but achievable with casualty rates far below pre-battle estimates. The numbers would tell the complete story. But those numbers would also raise uncomfortable questions about why this approach hadn't been attempted earlier, and how many lives might have been saved if flamethrower doctrine had evolved through combat experience rather than training manual specifications. During 72 hours of combat at Cape Mercus, 8 Marine flamethrower teams destroyed all 23 Japanese bunker positions, neutralized 2 artillery pieces, burned 14 enemy-occupied structures, and killed approximately 160 Japanese troops. This represented a 4-to-1 kill ratio with minimal friendly casualties, 1 flamethrower operator wounded, 0 killed. Traditional infantry assault doctrine predicted casualties of 40–60% for similar fortification reduction. The Marines suffered 8% casualties overall, with flamethrower teams accounting for less than 1%. The fuel expenditure totaled 184 gallons of napalm across 4 days of operations. Japanese defensive positions that military planners estimated would require week-long bombardment followed by costly infantry assault fell in an average of 47 seconds per bunker. The psychological impact proved equally significant. Intercepted Japanese radio transmissions from December 16th onward showed deteriorating morale and multiple requests for evacuation. These statistics changed everything about Pacific Theater bunker warfare. Within 6 weeks, every Marine division received expanded flamethrower allocations and revised tactical doctrine based on the Arawe operation. The tactical innovation rippled through the U.S. military command structure within days. Major Hayes submitted his after-action report on December 22, 1943. By January 5, 1944, copies had reached Marine headquarters in Hawaii, Army Command in Australia, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. The report included detailed diagrams showing firing angles, fuel consumption rates, and engagement distances that exceeded every established specification. Marine Corps schools at Quantico revised their flamethrower training program in February 1944. New doctrine emphasized long-range saturation fire over close-range precise targeting. Trainees practiced sustained bursts instead of short conserving shots. Mock bunkers were constructed with ventilation systems to teach operators how to exploit structural weaknesses. The graduation requirement changed from hitting targets at 20 yards to hitting them at 40 yards with 80% fuel delivery into simulated ventilation gaps. Army units preparing for European operations studied the Arawe reports differently. German bunkers in the Atlantic Wall used different construction, reinforced concrete instead of coral and logs. But the principle remained: every fortification needed ventilation, and ventilation meant vulnerability. Flamethrower allocation for D-Day assault units increased from 1 per company to 1 per platoon. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate tactical applications. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines had suffered 366 casualties, taking an island with similar defensive fortifications. The operation took 4 days and required massive naval bombardment. Arawe demonstrated that specialized weapons properly employed could reduce fortifications faster and with fewer casualties than traditional combined arms assault. How many lives could this save across dozens of remaining Pacific Island battles? The weapon itself evolved. The M22 variant, introduced in April 1944, incorporated lessons from Arawe. The fuel tank capacity increased to 6 gallons. The propellant pressure rose to 425 psi. The nozzle assembly received modifications that created a tighter stream pattern, extending effective range to 45 yards under test conditions. Combat reports from Saipan, Tinian, and Peleliu would confirm ranges exceeding 50 yards with experienced operators. Japanese forces adapted too. After intercepting reports about Arawe, Imperial Army engineers redesigned bunker ventilation systems. New fortifications used baffled air channels with multiple 90-degree turns, making direct napalm penetration impossible. But this created new problems. The complex ventilation systems were expensive, time-consuming to build, and often failed to provide adequate airflow in tropical climates. Many Japanese troops refused to occupy the new bunkers, preferring traditional designs despite their vulnerability to flamethrowers. Post-war applications expanded into unexpected domains. The U.S. Army used modified M2 tactics during Korean War bunker operations. British forces employed similar techniques in Malaya against jungle fortifications. The Israeli Defense Forces studied Arawe reports when developing tactics for the 1967 Sinai campaign. Soviet military doctrine, influenced by captured German analysis of American flamethrower use, incorporated long-range flame tactics into their assault engineer training. Lieutenant Morrison received the Silver Star for leadership during the Arawe operation. He survived the war, returned to Portland, and worked as a civil engineer designing water treatment facilities. He rarely spoke about his combat experience. In a 1982 interview for a Marine Corps historical project, he said, "We did what the situation required. The manual said one thing, the battlefield said another. We listened to the battlefield." Sergeant O'Brien stayed in the Marines, eventually reaching Master Sergeant before retiring in 1959. He became a firearms instructor, teaching 3 generations of Marines about weapons employment. His lecture on Arawe became legendary. He'd demonstrate how doctrine often lagged behind necessity, and how adaptation under fire saved more lives than rigid adherence to regulations. Corporal Vasquez was killed at Peleliu in September 1944, operating a flamethrower against a Japanese cave complex. His posthumous Navy Cross citation noted that his techniques, developed at Arawe, had enabled his unit to reduce 12 fortified positions in 6 hours. Private Jackson survived the war and became a metallurgical engineer. He held 17 patents for high-temperature alloy applications. He never made the connection between his flamethrower work and his later career, but the people who knew both found it obvious. Captain Martinez rose to colonel and commanded the 3rd Marine Regiment during the Korean War. His tactical innovations at Arawe influenced his broader approach to warfare. Find the enemy's assumption about what's possible, then prove them wrong. Private Murphy became a logistics officer, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. His fuel consumption calculations from Arawe appeared in supply manuals until the M2 was phased out in the 1960s. Could 8 men with specialized weapons really change how an entire military fought fortification warfare? The answer lay not in the weapon itself, but in the willingness to test its limits under combat conditions, to adapt when doctrine proved inadequate, and to document results so others could learn. The M2 flamethrower existed before Arawe. The tactical revolution it enabled required Marines willing to fire at 40 yards when the manual said 25 was maximum, to use sustained bursts when conservation was doctrine, and to target ventilation systems that nobody had considered vulnerable. On a coral beach in New Britain in December 1943, those 8 Marines discovered that sometimes the impossible was just the untried. 72 hours and 23 bunkers proved it. The flames that burned on Cape Merkus lit the way for every subsequent island assault in the Pacific War.